All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, now that it's midday. Thanks for joining us. My name's Naomi Newman. I'm with 3C Ren, and I've started the recording for this course. It'll be posted on 3C Ren's on-demand page. Today, we have Andy Pease and Tatiana Soglin from Inbalance Green Consulting, and they're going to talk about the California Green Building Standards and the requirements for residential and non-residential construction. And before I turn it over to them, I just have a few slides to go through. Just a quick overview again of Zoom. I'm sure we're all familiar with it, but please make sure that you're on mute throughout the duration of the course. If you'd like to verbally participate, please raise your hand in the participants section and we will call on you to unmute yourself. And we encourage you to use the chat box throughout the course, ask questions, and participate. A few words about 3C Ren. This is a Tri-County Regional Energy Network. We are a collaborative partnership between San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties that work to improve energy efficiency in our region by offering free programs and services for building professionals and households. It's funded by ratepayer dollars, which are collected on our utility bills, then public goods charge, and the benefit of this is that ratepayer dollars can be returned right back to our local community, which historically have missed out on some of these funds. The Energy Code Connect program serves building professionals by offering training and support to make the Energy Code easier to follow. Within the Energy Code Connect program, we offer the Energy Code Coach service, which is over the phone, online, and in the field support for Title 24 Part 6 and Part 11 related questions for both residential and non-residential projects. And we also offer online courses like the one today in regional forums. Another program we have is the Building Professional program, which serves building professionals such as architects, engineers, contractors, and real estate professionals by offering technical and soft skill trainings related to building science principles and high-performance buildings. And our last program is the Home Energy Savings Program, which incentivizes contractors and helps residents save money and make their homes healthier with energy-efficient upgrades through incentives and rebates. And with that, I will go ahead and pass things over to Andy.
Awesome. Great. Thanks everyone for being here. We're delighted as always to partner with 3C Ren to be able to provide classes. This one, we're going to be talking about CalGreen and the compliance process for residential and non-residential. There was obviously a new code in 2022, but there was also an intervening code cycle last week. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on that, talking about the mandatory measures and the benefits of that this is a code that has some really important benefits to builders and occupants. We'll touch a little bit on the tier 1, tier 2, the kind of voluntary measures, and throughout the course we'll be talking about best practices for reviewing and submitting the documentation itself. It's a lot of slides. It's just we put it all in there, and we'll send you the slides later. We'll dwell on the parts that are a little bit more that are newer, but there's just going to be a lot of reference material. So apologize for if things go like they're fast, but you'll get the slide. But first, we're going to start with a poll, and so we're just checking. Go ahead and launch that, and we're just checking to see, like, is this, are you brand new to this? Are you pretty comfortable, need the new stuff, super familiar, hopefully not in the wrong class. If you're not able to do the poll for some reason, feel free to put your remarks in the chat. Okay, looks like we got a few who are brand new and some familiarity, quite a few who know this stuff. If you live and breathe CalGreen, awesome. Thanks for coming. Feel free to chime things if we missed something. Always fun to have those as well. We'll give folks just another minute with that. And I understand it's your lunch hour, so do not feel obligated to turn on your cameras or anything. But if you'd like to chime in on something, we'd always love to see you. Okay. All right, I think we'll go ahead and move on. I appreciate the feedback. So this will be fairly, so what we ended up seeing was there's maybe 7 to 10 folks who are in the earlier stages of CalGreen, and then maybe another 15, 20 who are comfortable, know CalGreen, but really need to know the new stuff. So we'll be a little bit leaning towards assuming you know some stuff, but we'll be sure to touch on the basics as well. Okay, so just some background. This also helps when you're talking with your clients to be able to, when they grouse about something, that you can remind them where this all came from. That the intent of CalGreen is baseline. It's about raising the bar for the entire state, but having it be kind of a decent entry point for the design and building community. And so there's mandatory measures. All of the projects are going to require those. And then the voluntary and reach were intended for jurisdictions to be able to have a little bit higher. And you can either adopt the entire tier green, tier 1 or tier 2 as a jurisdiction, or you can spot grab them. So mandatory is what we're definitely going to focus on. That's what we see more of going on. And there's an evolution, right, in our code cycle. So in 1975 is when we started the California Energy Commission and the Energy Code. And it was good, and it's been an amazing progression and catching it early for us. In the late 90s, early 2000 is when LEED came online, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a totally separate nonprofit entity. And so that's been a successful program. And then in 2009, California adopted CalGreen. It was totally voluntary at first, and then has become mandatory over each cycle, but they modeled it after LEED. Yay, that was huge. It was really helpful to be able to kind of have some parallel. And so it made it understanding for the folks who were already doing that, and it has continued to be a good structure for us. So as we go forward, we're getting better buildings, and they're more sustainable, energy efficient, all of those pieces. So the highlights from the 2022 code change, it was really all about electric vehicles. The requirements, how it was structured, increased requirements for actual charging stations. There's some new ones for volatile organic compounds and emissions for insulation, acoustic ceiling tiles, etc. There was a new requirement that if you're tinkering with a parking lot or doing a major alteration, it would trigger EV charging. That was new. That had never been in the code before. Then in the intervening code cycle, the one that came just July 1st, huge focus on embodied carbon. So we'll spend some time on that. And even more about EV charging. So you can see where California is going in terms of the electric vehicle focus and as part of our climate action. And then there are some additional measures in voluntary tiers, both for those EV charging and embodied carbon, but for some other elements as well. All right, so then just as a little reminder about where we are in the code, so Title 24 is the entire California building standards. We shortcut when we say a Title 24 report, we're shortcutting Part 6, the Energy Code, but today this focus is on Part 11, California Green Building Standards Code. We nickname it CalGreen, and it is not to be confused with the Energy Code, although you will see some cross referencing. The other important thing about the CalGreen is that we have different jurisdictions or different agencies that manage them. So HCD is managing the residential section of CalGreen, whereas the BFC manages the non-residential. And then, of course, you have DSA for state, OSHPD for the medical hospitals and that type of thing. So within each section of the code, you'll see who's adopting what. So DSA and OSHPD typically have not been adopting the whole thing, or there are some special requirements within the code itself. This is how CalGreen is organized in terms of admin definitions, the scope, and the mandatory measures, chapters 3, 4, and 5. That's where we're going to spend our time. And then there's appendices and forms as well. And do flag me. Are you checking the chat to make sure? So if you do have a question, want me to pause on something, be sure to type it into the chat, or you can even raise a hand. Okay, so then in chapter 3, this is important because of the scope. In the residential, all new residential construction needs to follow CalGreen. If you're doing an alteration and addition, just the new parts need to follow CalGreen. It doesn't trigger retrofitting unless it's part of a retrofit that's required by something else. So in particular, old plumbing fixtures will have to be upgraded, but that's not part of CalGreen. That's just part of California water code. So in the non-residential side, though, it's for all new construction, but the addition needs to be over 1,000 square feet or alterations over $200,000 in permit valuation. So if you're doing a really small non-res, they're not going to follow up. It's good practice. It's probably mostly habit as the kind of measures, but in terms of needing to turn in the checklist and the documentation. And as we mentioned, parking lot alterations or additions now are part of the CalGreen scope. It's also, you need to make sure to check for mixed occupancies. The residential parts need a residential checklist and the non-res need a non-res checklist. So that's particularly in mixed use, hotel, motels might have that. If it's a multifamily building in the community room, that's only for the use of the residents, that still fits within the residential code. But if has a restaurant downstairs or a retail shop or something, the retail that's open to the public would fit into non-res. So you might need 2 checklists. And then for phased buildings, it just applies to whatever part is in that scope. So again, a shell building might just have whatever components are for that, but maybe it doesn't have plumbing. But then the tenant improvement will need to comply with CalGreen, right? Okay, so, and then a tenant improvement has to hit those thresholds for a renovation, right? That with the 1,000 square feet or the $200,000 valuation. All right, so how did we actually show compliance? We have an Excel spreadsheet with all the codes, and then that way we can reference the notes, but the AIA California has put together this handy dandy full page sheet. So if you're an AIA member, you can get a hold of this, but it's only useful if you follow the notes. There's like a yes, not applicable, and then a reference. So you can't just put this sheet on and be done. That's like putting the code on your plans, but not incorporate it into the drawings itself, right? So, so for whichever one, if it's for outdoor irrigation, then you would show where on the landscape plan that actual compliance is shown, right? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump into the mandatory measures of chapter 4 and 5. Again, we were mentioning that this lines up with LEED. So in LEED, it's site or location and transportation. Here, it's planning and design. Then we go to energy efficiency and then water efficiency. That's switched from LEED in the order, but still in those same categories. Then material conservation, and then environmental quality is the last one. So that's kind of all the indoor air quality components. Chapter 4 or division 4 is all residential and 5 is non-residential, but they parallel each other. So as we go through this, we're going to, when they're on the same page, when they're on the same topic, we'll address them together. Also, each one of these has the code reference down in the bottom right corner so that you'll be able to circle back to the code. And throughout, we'll kind of have these orange boxes when we have particular notes about documentation. It's just, if we can make it easier for the plans examiners and the builders, that's a win for everyone, right? Okay, we good still? All right, so the very first section under 5 in the planning and design is that effective July 1st, part of the intervening code cycle is an option for the embodied carbon for additions and alterations. But before we dig into that, it's super involved and there's 3 different paths. So we're going to put a pin in that and we'll talk about it when we get to the materials section, which is the bulk of it. Okay, so pretend that didn't happen and we'll see you again in chapter 5 or 4, I guess. Okay, so these are ones I'm going to skip through because they've been in the code a long time, but just for folks who are new or want that kind of refresher, like, oh yeah, that's where I find that. So stormwater pollution prevention during construction for smaller, less than an acre, you're just kind of doing your best practices in terms of erosion control. And then if it's larger than an acre, then you're going to get into the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. This is very well monitored, and you're going to have your plans. They'll be looked at closely. So this is, it's almost token that it's in here because it's monitored very closely. But grading and paving, this is important. Again, this is a good best practice. And what we're trying to do is both have water obviously slope away from the building, and that should be shown on about any flat work that's near doors of the building itself, what that slope is. But also in this image here, it's like we're really moving toward capturing stormwater in more in ways that match the natural hydrology. So that we have these bioswales, permeable paving, all the types of ways that we're keeping slowing, spreading, sinking water, stormwater on site. Okay, going on to bicycle parking. This is didn't particularly change in the last cycle, but we still sometimes see people get dinged up on it. In short term, there's short term and long term bike parking. And so short term is for guests, and it could just be a regular bike rack, but it needs to be within 200 feet of the entry. As a cyclist, I would also ask it be someplace super obvious because it's really hard to be circling all over the building looking for them. And it's in a ratio of how many parking spaces you have. Now, if you have a big open lot and it is for employees and guests, then you need to kind of make a call how many of those are guests and how many are employees. It won't matter for anything else, but it is the metric that's used for short-term and long-term bike parking. And so for long-term bike parking, so if you think of your employees, they want to bike to work, that they want someplace that's secure for their nice bikes. So it could be lockers outside or a room inside, but it needs to be something secure. So a couple of examples. Oh, and public schools and community colleges have slightly different requirements, as you can imagine, more. And you should put them on the both the bike calculation so that the jurisdiction having authority has an easy way to make sure that you have enough, and then you need to show them on the site. It's either a site plan, architectural site plan, or landscape, or ideally all 3. Okay, so what are some good options for that long-term bike parking? So it could be a cage, it could be a cage in the parking garage, or have some other access, these kind of little bike lockers that we've mentioned. But it can't be like things that are too heavy. This is kind of a questionable one here on the right in terms of like if you have to wheel the bike, and especially with these e-bikes, those are pretty limited in terms of a visitor rack. And this one on the bottom right isn't anchored, so it needs to be a permanently secured bike rack in order to meet that requirement. Okay, now we're going to get into the electric vehicle charging. We'll do some EV readiness, kind of the definitions. We'll talk about single family, multifamily, and non-res. Then again, new in 22 was the getting ready for medium and heavy duty trucks charging. And then finally, the additions and alterations. Have we been able to address questions as they come up? Are we still doing okay on that?
Yeah, we're still good on that.
Excellent. All right, so there's basically 3 types of EV charging infrastructure that's discussed in the code. The first is EV capable. That's the lowest threshold. It's basically an empty conduit that goes from the panel to where you might have charging in the future. So you can't use it for charging anything, but it's also not really wasted resources. So that's EV capable. EV ready is having a space that it's fully wired and it has maybe a receptacle, but it doesn't actually have the charging equipment. So it's ready for equipment, but and it has space in the electrical panel, but it's not actually for charging. And then the third category is the actual EV charging. And so it's a level 2 EV, and this is SE is supply equipment, and that makes a charging station, which is an EVCF. I just apologize on behalf of the California Building Code that we have to make that so confusing. All right, this little diagram I end up circling back to because the names are just not intuitive. Okay, and then just for folks who are not necessarily EV vehicle drivers, users, if that's newer. So level 1 is basically the slowest you could possibly charge a car is just an outlet. That's not referenced in the code at all because it's only 120 volt, 16 amp. Level 2 is when it starts to be useful. This could be the actual charger is 208, 240 volt, 40 amp. So that's important that it gets that higher amperage because there's another offering that's a lower amperage. And then these direct current fast charger, which you think of as Tesla, but there's a whole bunch of them now. They're allowed in the code, but they're not required. So we'll talk about some options for substitution. For those ones where it's EV capable and it's could be, or even the EV ready, it needs to be really well labeled. You want to, if you've done the work of putting in a conduit, you got to make sure that it makes it super easy for somebody in the future to come in and install those EVs, the charging stations. So you got to label the breaker. You have to have the stub up labeled for at the actual EV space. But you don't label the parking stall because that would be confusing to the public. So think of it as communicating to the owners and managers in the future about what's capable, but don't actually mark the stalls for people until you get to an actual charging station. And then clearly you can, you should mark those that it's for EV charging only. And depending on which charger, they can be there all day. Or they might need to rotate if it's a Tesla. Okay, new single family. This is the lowest bar. All you have to do is that EV capable. It's that empty conduit to a panel, so somebody could do it in the future. This was a big discussion point in the code, but in the end they decided because the acceptance of the adoption of EV charging is all over the place still. They didn't want to have people spending money and a material resource in copper of having this wire abandoned kind of in these conduits all over the state, right? So that's how I kind of think about EV capable, lowest bar. And that's not required for if you're doing accessory dwelling units or junior accessory dwelling units. The state has a very low bar for adding ADUs and JADUs. So they do not trigger the requirement for EV capable. And that's if you have an attached, if you have a garage associated with it, right? Okay, so multifamily and hotel motels. Okay, so last month we had EV capable and EV ready, and now we have more. So as of July 1st, 40% of all the parking spaces need to be low power level 2 EV charging receptacles, which I'll touch on in the next slide. And then 10% are level 2 EV chargers. Okay, so level 2 low power, what are we doing? So again, this is new. So it's like, what are we doing? Oh, this is new. So this is a level 2 charger, 40 amp is an actual, it's like a charger, but the low power one is something you might have in your garage. So it's an outlet, and you can fit in this kind of charger to your car. So it's a little slower, but not too bad. And so what that does for you is that it it's serving the most likely car charging options. Okay, and then a special note here, again, I had to read this a couple times to make sure I was understanding what the goal is here, but the plan is, if you can, the EV charging receptacle shall be provided with a branch circuit to the dwelling unit's electrical panel. So this is not, if you've got a multifamily housing, the charging is not associated with the house, hallway lighting and that type of thing. It should be assigned to, if the parking spaces are assigned to the unit, then you have to have the charging stations assigned to the units. And that makes sense, right? Because you have a certain amount of the alignment of your power use with your electric bill. There's exceptions. If you can't do it, that's okay. If it's not feasible for whatever reason, but that is the intent, is to have it charging to the individuals. Okay, in the non-res world, there's a table, and it's based on the number of electric vehicle charging stations and how many of them count. So basically, again, this empty conduit requirement. And the kind of weird thing here is that then the number of charging stations is deducted out of the capable. So if you have 28 parking spaces, 8 of them need to be capable, but 2 of those need to actually have charging stations. So you're really doing 6 capable with empty conduit, and 2 that have the charging stations. So again, apologies on behalf of the code, that is a little confusing, but that is the intent. Interestingly, so it's a reminder, the supply equipment that they reference here versus an EV charging station. And then at least 1 level 2 supply equipment shall be provided. Okay, now why would they say that? Because they already just said it needs to be supply equipment. Well, that's because they give you a few options to be able to comply. So if you are in a community where people are going to have fast chargers, you can actually sub out. You can do a level 2, or you can, if you have 1 DC fast charger, it can substitute for 5 of the level 2 chargers. So if you require 8 level 2 chargers, you can do 1 of the Tesla type and the other 3 as the level 2, or you could do 2 and that would cover it, except for that this little requirement, at least 1 of them needs to be a regular level 2, because they figure not everybody's going to have a Tesla. Okay. The opposite is also true, is that you can do a, if you have low power, you can do twice as many of the low power ones. So 1 low power is a half of a regular level 2. They're just slower, right? So you need more of them. And then the final of these alternative approaches is a power allocation method. There's a bunch of formulas, but basically is you can do a mix and match as long as you get the kilovolt amperage that you need per number of parking spaces. I haven't used that yet. I haven't worked through it. If anybody has any insights into if that's really helpful or not. But I think they're just trying to make sure that we have enough flexibility in the different arenas to be able to, kind of predict where the EV charging market is going. Okay, and then just a reminder that any type of parking, blah, 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 electric vehicle still needs to have access compliance. If it's in the, if it's hotels, motels, public housing, it's going to trigger ADA access, electric vehicles. There's different ways to do it. You can have like 1 charger that goes to the compliance here. If it doesn't show up in chapter 11, there's also in CalGreen, there's specific dimensions for electric vehicle spaces to make sure that they're hitting the right minimum size requirement. And it does not count for your accessible parking. So if you need 3 accessible parking spaces for your project, you need electric vehicle spaces, then the electric vehicle space needs to be van accessible, and it doesn't count for your 3 minimum ones, right? Because you don't want somebody like taking up the charging space and not allowing for EV. So again, bigger topic. Hopefully that's enough for you to remember to just check on the access compliance. All right, and then kind of going on to this came out new in 2022, is that we need to have capacity for kind of the electrical capacity and raceways, so the conduit, this is that EV capable type of thing for trucks. And in up through last month, it was grocery stores, retail, and warehouses. And then you could kind of see like the size of the building. As of last week, we have now added manufacturing facilities and office buildings of a certain size. So we're going EV trucks. And we want to make sure that we're ready as a state. So there's kind of a KVA and capacity requirements there. Okay. There's also new EV charging at public schools and community colleges, very similar to the non-res, just a slightly different table. These are a couple spots from Cal Poly. And then this parking lot additions and alterations. And again, the idea here is that if you're just restriping, refinishing, it doesn't trigger the requirements. But if you are adding on like new square footage of parking, or if you're digging it up enough that you're adding electrical solar panels, or you're adding lighting, so you're running conduit, you're messing with the electrical, that you need to add in electric charging in alignment if it's res or non-res. So for residential HCD projects, it says 10% of spaces that are added or altered must be EV ready. For non-res, basically whatever you've triggered now needs to meet the non-res requirements. Documentation for EVs, again, let's make it easy for our plan reviewers. Have the calculations on the cover sheet, show the number of spaces. And then there's 2 ways to label the plans. One is this is kind of showing that this is a EV ready space. And this is for the plans examiners to know where to put things, or coordination with your electrical engineer. But down here, EV charging only, that communicates to your builder what striping to put on the stall. So just make sure it's super clear between those two, what's being striped on the stall by the contractor versus communicating to the team and the plans reviewer where you have the conduit stubbing up and that type of thing. Okay, and then of course, sufficient capacity should be shown on your electrical sheets, and again, make it super obvious for that electrician to understand about labeling it as well. If you've been doing this for a while, you remember we used to have this whole designated parking for clean air, van pool, EV, and all of that's gone. We're not doing that anymore because now we have charging stations. So code moves quickly. You'll still find lots of parking lots that have this kind of striping and labeling, but that's no longer part of the code. You can add, there is a voluntary measure option that you can get some credit for it.
Really quick before
Sure.
we move on from EVs, we have a question from Peggy. Do third-party level 3 high-speed chargers provided by an EV charger company get credited to the property owner?
My understanding is yes. If it is on the property, yes. Then even if there's a fee associated with it, it doesn't say you can't charge for the electricity. Great question. Good. Okay, so in fact, we did that for the hotel down in AG to be able to, that's what they did. They had a fast charger there. All right, I'm going to finish up the site, the planning and design credit before we move on to the water. And there's just a couple left in here. Just outdoor lighting. Again, this has been in the code a long time. Keeping track of that backlight, uplight, and glare, the bug ratings. It does, the one thing that they did fix in 2022, or maybe even the intervening code cycle before that, is to align it with the energy code, because there was an exception if it's a super low wattage, or lumens with less than 6,200 initial lumens doesn't need to show their bug rating. So do provide a lighting schedule on the site plan or the electrical plan with the required bug rating and the bug rating of the fixture, so you can just check and make sure that it complies. We've gotten dinged on that one for sure. A lot of people, especially if they're super unusual light fixtures, they just might not have bug ratings. And then for schools, there's a requirement for shade trees. So be sure to check that out if you're doing schools. And so that's the site, the planning and design credit. And then energy efficiency, for both residential and non-residential, the requirement is to comply with Title 24, Part 6, the energy code, any local reach codes. And that's it, truly, energy code. Okay, and then we're going to go on to water. And I'm gonna let Tatiana take that one on.
All right, thanks, Andy. All right. The requirements for fixtures and fittings are pretty straightforward. We have this chart here showing the allowed flush and flow rates in gallons per minute, gallons per flush, or gallons per cycle. An important thing to pay attention to here are things like water sense labels for toilets and shower heads. And another thing we want to make a note of is the residential bathrooms that have a maximum of 1.2 gallons per minute, but also they're the only fixture with a minimum rate of 0.8 gallons per minute. So sometimes in mixed use buildings, there will be a blanket 0.5 GPM faucet put in for all lavatory faucets, but that doesn't meet the minimum requirement for residential. So we want to make sure we're hitting that threshold in the residential spaces. Pre-rinse spray valves were added as part of the 2022 code cycle. This used to be a tier 1 option, but is now included as part of the mandatory measures. And these must have a flow rate lower than 1.0 GPM. And it's regulated under Title 20, but is referenced in the CalGreen code. So there's also mandatory measures related to water submeters. We put together this decision tree to see if it's required depending on the project and use types. So for non-residential projects, a new construction project or addition over 50,000 square feet needs a submeter if you have a use over 100 gallons a day. If it's less than 50,000 square feet, you don't need a submeter unless the use is considered excessive. And excessive consumption is a use over 1,000 gallons per day. This could be something like a building with multiple tenants. If there's a use like a restaurant or a laundromat, in those cases, you'll need submeters. And then for multifamily, all units must be submetered per the plumbing code. Food waste disposers also have a gallons per minute maximum threshold. They must be less than 1 gallon per minute when not in use, or have an automatic shutoff after 10 minutes, and less than 8 gallons per minute when in use. And so all of this needs to be included in the plumbing fixture schedule. For landscaping and outdoor water use, you'll use the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, MWELO for short. It's a tool for looking at outdoor water usage for landscapes over 500 square feet. You'll need a table similar to this one. It doesn't need to be color coded. But in the bottom left, there's a calculation for the maximum applied water allowance, or MAWA, giving the amount of gallons of water you're allowed to use annually based on the project's location and the landscape area. And then you'll compare that to the proposed usage, which is based on plant type and irrigation efficiency. And this should be provided somewhere on the landscape plans. So for special uses, MWELO is required for public schools and community colleges where there's 500 square feet of newly constructed landscape projects or 1,200 square feet of rehabilitated landscape projects. And healthcare facilities must comply as well. In previous code cycles, recycled water was required for commercial projects and optional for residential if the purple pipe or municipal recycled water supply was available. In this cycle, it was removed from the code's mandatory measures, so it's no longer required. And it's likely because if the recycled supply is available, both the market and the municipality would kind of drive the decision to use it. And now I think I'm passing it back over to you.
Yeah. We'll keep trading here.
Yeah.
So now we're going on to the part 4, the material conservation and resource efficiency. Just a couple of quick notes here, just the rodent proofing, making sure that for these residential projects that if you have a penetration, that you're not just packing foam or something around it. It needs to be cementitious or metal, but the critters chew right through the foam, so don't do that. And then just having a weather resistant exterior wall and foundation, of course. Make sure sprinklers, this bottom left is kind of classic in terms of a building having sprinklers going onto the building itself, which is super destructive, but mostly we're doing drip irrigation anyway. This is one that folks sometimes miss, is just that the areas that are opening, not only do you need to have it be water resistant materials, non-absorbent flooring within 2 feet around that opening, but any regular entry, so it could be just an employee entrance as well, not an emergency exit or something, but main areas need to have either a 4-foot deep overhang or a recess, right? So you need to have, you can't just have an exposed door or an exposed door with just 2 inches of reset. And that makes sense, right? You don't want the water coming into the building every time the door is open. It does, we do get rain here sometimes. And then under construction waste diversion, it's up to 65%. Of course, it was at 50% for years. So you have to have a plan, and there's also an option that you can reduce the generation that came out of a LEED program, that if you just generate less waste. I have found that extraordinarily difficult to do. It's just, you have to be really efficient or do a lot of off-site prefab kind of manufacturing. And then you can do either source separation on site, or you can have it be sorted off site, but provided with the documentation. And then again, the reduced volume option. For additions and alterations, you've got to be able to track household hazardous waste. And so that's the fluorescent lamps, any thermostats that have mercury, that type of thing. And of course, land clearing debris needs to go right into the compost. So documentation is pretty straightforward in terms of permitting, that you have to have notes that you're going to do this. But in terms of waste management, most jurisdictions are going to require documentation of the diversion itself in the plan. Okay, woo! Embodied carbon. Turning that back to Tatiana.
All right. Circling back to embodied carbon, effective last Monday, July 1st, it is now required as part of CalGreen code to address embodied carbon on non-residential projects 100,000 square feet or more, or schools under jurisdiction of DSA 50,000 square feet or more. This will reduce on January 1st of 2026 to 50,000 square feet for all non-residential projects. And there are 3 pathways to compliance. We'll talk you through each of these. It's building reuse, life cycle analysis, and the prescriptive path.
Try again.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So to understand each option, we need to know what embodied carbon is, where embodied carbon shows up in the construction process, and the scope for looking at each of those pathways. So embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions arising from manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. We don't want to get this confused with operational carbon, which is related to the greenhouse gas emissions due to building energy consumption. That's probably the carbon emissions you're most used to hearing about. So focusing on embodied, you may have seen charts like this showing where you'll find the carbon in the construction process. This cradle to gate scope looks at the product stage. This is your raw materials extraction, transportation, manufacturing, things that go into making the product. And this is the scope you'll look at for the prescriptive pathway. And next is cradle to grave. This includes that product stage, but also construction, use, and end of life stages. This is the scope included in the whole building life cycle assessment. And last is cradle to cradle, which includes the whole cradle to grave scope, but additionally includes things beyond the building life cycle. So that'll be like recycling or reuse, which is where we'll be looking at the existing building reuse category. Okay, so a little more detailed overview. We have our building reuse option for additions, where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. The mandatory measure requires 45% of the structure and enclosure to be reused. Next is the whole building life cycle analysis. This is the modeling pathway, where you'll need to show a 10% reduction in embodied carbon from a baseline building. And last is the prescriptive pathway, which targets carbon reductions in specific materials. For the mandatory measure, this limits the global warming potential to 175% of the industry-wide average from environmental product declarations. And we're gonna dig into each of these here. So first option is reuse of an existing building. Again, this method is for additions or alterations where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. So for our example here, we have a 45,000 square foot existing building and an 80,000 square foot addition. So it's more than the 100,000 square foot threshold to trigger the need for an embodied carbon analysis, but less than 2 times the existing area. So this method targets primary structural elements and building enclosure materials, as seen here on the bottom left, and you're excluding hazardous materials as well as windows and insulation. And that's to encourage replacing the windows and insulation with higher performing materials. So this is a really quick example of how you do the calculation and documentation. CalGreen provides this worksheet 3, where we'll first enter the area of the existing building, 45,000 square feet, and the area of the addition, 80,000. Then you'll make a quick spreadsheet like this, listing your areas for the primary structure and enclosure elements. And in this example, we have the perimeter foundation, concrete floor, CMU walls, lateral beams, excluding windows, and then the roof framing and exterior finishes. And those all add up, and you'll drop the totals in the table below for the existing area. And then for the retained area, let's say we're keeping the perimeter foundation, concrete floor, half of the CMU walls and the exterior finishes, and then demoing the lateral beams and getting a new roof. So you add up your retained square footage, drop those values in the table below, and then it's just a percentage. So in this example, we're retaining 54.57%. And as a reminder, the total percentage just needs to exceed 45% to comply. So the second method is the whole building life cycle assessment. To use this one, you'll need to build a model similar to an energy model, but instead of measuring energy usage, you're measuring embodied carbon. So this is looking at that cradle to grave scope over a reference study period of 60 years. You're looking at the same materials as in the building reuse method, except this time you're including the glazing and insulation. And we get a lot of questions on how to generate a baseline to compare your design building to. That reference building or your baseline building should have the same location, orientation, size, function, and space conditioning as the proposed, and that way you're ensuring that you're just comparing the materials. And the materials baseline should be based off of what a typical building design for that type of project in that location would have. And we've listed some tools here below. Athena and One-Click LCA are free tools, and there are paid software options as well, such as Sphera, SEMA Pro, and Tally. And Tally in particular has a Revit plugin. So if you have a good Revit model already built, it can be imported into that program so that another model doesn't have to be built from scratch. Okay, so this is an example of what a project looks like in Athena. It's a typical trunk and branch structure, again, similar to an energy model. You'll go through and describe building assemblies through dialog boxes that request simple information like base sizes and loads, and the software does the rest. It'll calculate a bill of materials and the associated environmental impacts for you. Users have the flexibility to add materials as needed or import their own bill of materials from any CAD program. We have a more in-depth presentation digging into the weeds on how to use Athena that can be found on the 3C Run website in part 4 of our ZNCD series from last year. And the Athena portion starts at about minute 30. I'm going to also drop the link in the chat right now. Okay. And the last of the 3 pathways for embodied carbon is the prescriptive path. This method has a much more limited scope, targeting some higher impact materials determined by the Buy Clean California program, like certain types of steel, glass, and insulation, and of course, concrete. So this table here shows you the maximum acceptable global warming potential value, which is based off of industry-wide averages. For products on the top half of the chart, you just need to find products with a global warming potential below what is allowed. For concrete on the bottom half, compliance is determined by a weighted calculation. Each type of concrete has a different allowed GWP value and will have a different actual GWP. So to determine compliance, you follow this equation, multiply each actual GWP with the volume used, add those together, and you get the total carbon impact. And then do the same for GWP allowed, and you'll want to make sure that the actual GWP value is lower than the allowed. And you'll get the product data for each material on environmental product declarations or EPDs. And an example is seen here where the GWP value is in that first row. So most of us are probably not working on 100,000 square foot buildings where.
Sorry,
Oh,
that was my bad. No.
there we go.
Sorry.
So, most of us are not working on 100,000 square foot buildings where the embodied carbon requirement is triggered by code. But as we mentioned earlier, the square footage threshold will be reduced to 50,000 square feet in 2026. And over time, we can expect it to become relevant to a wider variety of projects. So we want to start thinking more about strategies addressing embodied carbon now, so you can start implementing some of this. And then when the time comes and it's required for projects you're working on, you'll already be familiar with it. So this slide's calling out some of the high impact material categories for a cost-effective low carbon product selection. As we know, concrete is generally going to give you the highest reduction potential at no to low cost premium by substituting cement with alternative cementitious material. Next, we have rebar, which has a potential for up to a 10% reduction by using rebar with recycled content. There's also emerging technologies like fiberglass rebar we're starting to hear more about. And similarly, structural steel with high recycled content can make a significant impact, or using things like mass timber instead. Insulation is an interesting one. We'll look at that a little bit more on the next slide, but a big difference can be made using materials other than foam. Glazing can have a little bit of a higher cost, but using low carbon window frame materials and specifying no more than 2 panes of glazing are strategies for reducing embodied carbon. But of course, if you're specifying fewer panes of glazing, you also have to think about window performance and how that will impact energy consumption. So that one can have a little bit of a trade-off between embodied and operational carbon emissions. And lastly, finished materials can also contribute by selecting low carbon and durable materials. When possible, reusing is best, or designing for deconstruction and future reuse. Okay, so taking a little bit of a closer look at insulation, this slide here displays the embodied carbon of different insulation materials, some shown as net carbon emitting and others net carbon sequestering. So not all insulation will work for all conditions, but where substitutions are feasible, charts like this can kind of act as a guide to select alternative products. And the numbers shown here are based on an R20 value for each insulation type. So we can see that it varies greatly. Foam materials tend to be pretty common and are among the highest in carbon emissions. Mineral wool is still net emitting, though much lower than foam, and fiberglass is a bit lower. Switching to non-petroleum products such as cellulose, hempcrete, and straw bale can move us toward sequestering. Oops, that's not what to do. We have some other examples to the right of expanded cork, wood fiberboard like Gutex, and there's even emerging technologies like mycelium board, which is made out of mushrooms. So we can see insulation has a lot of options for material replacements. There's always new technologies coming along, so something to keep an eye on. So we have a lot more information on this topic. We have a whole other presentation completely dedicated to looking much deeper into each of these 3 embodied carbon strategies, and a lot more information on sequestering as well. So that presentation is also available for free on demand on the 3C Run website, and I'll drop the link for that one in the chat as well. And I think I'm handing it back to Andy.
All right, awesome. Yeah, we're super excited about the embodied carbon. We understand that the operational carbon has a lot of has the carbon savings over the life of the building, whereas those embodied carbon emissions, the associated with construction and transportation and manufacturing of the building itself and the product, those are impactful now. So help us get to our climate goals in a timely way as we need them. So, and then just a few more items within the materials section. The operation and maintenance manual is for, in terms of residential, you need to provide the building owner representative with a manual that contains all this stuff about how to operate a building, warranties, and then, and interestingly, in this intervening code cycle, they actually added a couple sections to those requirements. Defensible space, so they're thinking about wildfire activity and how to impact that. So do be sure to check that out. I feel like this is one section of the code that's kind of, you know, just has dwindled in terms of use. So, but I think it's really important, and the manual can be online. It can be cloud-based as well. So definitely check out that section. And then in terms of non-residential, really the tool there is commissioning, and that's the we'll talk about commissioning in a moment, but that's really the key way to be able to for a non-res, to make sure that it's operating the way it was designed in the first place. You do have to have space for recycling, and including organic waste collection, right? That's new to the California code, so that's been incorporated into it. So all residential uses, but also restaurants are particularly impactful. So making sure as designers that you have trash, you know, kind of landfill, recycling, and green waste or organics systems for that. So be sure to consider that. This is, again, just a reminder about commissioning, this whole cycle, that it starts with by design development, you should already have a commissioning authority on board, and even sooner, and if you want assistance with those owner project requirements. So the owner project requirements, the basis of design, the plans and specifications, all of that stuff is done up front, and even the commissioning plan is done. So when you think about all the requirements for new buildings over 10,000 square feet, these first four are all required as part of your building permit. So don't wait on getting a commissioning authority if you have a non-res building over 10,000 square feet. And then the rest of it is the actual performance testing, documentation of the training, commissioning report, checking the O&M manual. All of those things happen during construction and toward the end of construction. And then there's not necessarily specific things that needs to be submitted at that point, but the jurisdiction, the inspector can ask for all of those documents. And then commissioning is one of those areas that overlaps with the energy code. So the energy code has these nifty forms that you can fill out online, and it shows you which things you need to complete in terms of all of those documents. There's a lot of forms available online and in the codes if you would like to use those. So it's required also in the energy code. But in the energy code, there's requirements for projects that are under 10,000 square feet to have a design review. That can be done internally, but you still have a commissioning document to do, even if your non-res project is under 10,000 square feet. So be sure to check that out. The other thing that's interesting is that only CalGreen adds in commissioning of irrigation and the PV panels. So you end up doing, they overlap, but each piece has like a little bit of an additional requirement. And then in CalGreen, for projects that are under 10,000 square feet, there's a regular testing and adjusting requirement that you're familiar with in terms of like tab. But the idea here is that the engineer is part of outlining that process ahead of time. So it's not just the HVAC contractor doing a test and balance. This is the outlined and has a report at the end. So the documentation there should include notes and specifications. All right, and then the last section here is the environmental quality, and the ones that are familiar, of course, you can't have open combustion for fireplaces, if you have those. For temporary ventilation, it's a MERV 8. MERV refers to the kind of thickness and capacity of the air filter. And so permanent HVAC systems require MERV 13, and it needs to be stated on the filter so that people can see that. Again, that was a code update from last time. We've gotten pretty good compliance out of this one now. I think folks have caught on in terms of openings of ducts, because what used to happen is that ducts would be hung up or they would come onto site and have dust. And then there'd be a little bit of moisture there, and then the dust would get damp and it would grow things, and it would be installed and in a system and getting people really ill. So there's been a lot of focus on having the ducts be delivered on site, already capped with the ends capped, so you're not getting construction dust in there. And then once they're installed, having it capped down here at the bottom. And these old ways of doing it that you might still see, these are not okay. You can't just stick in a little bit of foam or have them, be crushed or just kind of like tuck in the ends. You need to have kind of an actual tape. So do monitor for that and make sure that they arrive covered. Same with equipment too. If by chance you see them uncovered, just ask them to get them cleaned. It's not like you have to reject the whole duct system, but it does need to be professionally cleaned if they ended up getting dusty from either the job site dust or drywall dust is a pretty big culprit on that. For pollutant control, that's been one of the earliest ones, low emitting materials. Just thankfully, we've gotten pretty good about making sure that we know the thresholds. The only time we kind of get dinged is somebody uses an outdoor product like a roofing mastic inside. That might be over the threshold, but usually people are pretty good about that. And then you have to have cut sheets. So the building inspector is allowed to ask for all these materials. So on our projects, we like to either have a binder or just have a Dropbox folder with a PDF with all of the VOC levels highlighted. And new for 2022 is adding insulation, ceiling tiles, and wall panels in terms of the low emitting requirements. Those were voluntary measures under Tier 1 and Tier 2, but now they're mandatory measures. So yeah, you can either have like a third-party certificate. Tobacco smoke, we're a no smoking community. Most folks know that, but we do still need to make sure that that the smoking outside of the building is labeled and practiced in compliance. So 25 feet from the building entries or outdoor air intakes or operable windows, and of course in the buildings themselves. So what ends up happening is that people know not to smoke inside, but they'll smoke right outside the door. Or maybe they know not to smoke right outside the door, but they'll be smoking right next to an air intake that's just 10 feet above them, right? So, so having it be smoke-free may not, that's just kind of a little too generic in terms of indoor, outdoor. This one says no smoking within 25 feet of all building entrances. That might work if you don't have any air intakes or operable windows, but the way to really be sure that you're in with compliance with the code is this last option here. And then within the concrete slab, vapor retarders, capillary breaks, making sure that you have like this one here on the left, that doesn't have the vapor retarder, and it needs to be like thick enough and taped off, right? You can't, you don't want the moisture coming up from that. And again, a lot of emphasis just on the damage of moisture, not just for the durability of the building, but because of indoor air quality and illness that occurs from the growth of mold. So of course, not letting things get wet, keeping them wrapped, keeping them totally wrapped. And this is a moisture meter that they can put in for the studs. You can't exceed 19% moisture content. And then exhaust fans, just making sure that in your bathroom fans that they're triggered by, that they have a humidistat, not just a timer kind of control. You can't just do windows anymore. You certainly can do windows, but it also needs to have the fans triggered by the humidistat. And it can be in conjunction if you have a whole house ventilation or ducted ventilations. Those things can work together as long as you have the relative humidity and the ongoing ventilation as well, which is in the energy code. There's a section about using ACA manuals J, D, and F for ducted design. So, because we used to do the rule of thumb, like, oh, it's a 3-bedroom, 2,000 square feet, whatever, and then they would just kind of size the system, and it would often be oversized, and that's a waste of energy. So do show your drawings, the calculations in order to comply with these. If you're doing ductless systems, you don't need the ducted design calculations, of course. And then outdoor air delivery monitoring, carbon dioxide monitoring for non-residential projects. Again, these are ones that have been in the code a long time. Acoustic control is one that sometimes we see missed. And the idea there is that if you have a multi-tenant space that you require a minimum sound transmission class, STC of 40, and so of at least 40. And so if here's an example on the bottom where you might be doing a tenant improvement and you're just doing one side, but you got to make sure that that wall that you're building as part of the tenant improvement is at least STC 40 and tenant spaces from the public. So if there were a hallway or something like that, you can do double studs, you can do different materials, acoustic materials. STC 40 is not particularly stringent. And then if you are in someplace noisy, like near an airport or a freeway or near train, then your walls and roof need to be STC 50 and your windows have to be an STC 40 or an OITC of 30. So these kind of sound transmission maps are usually like a municipality will have it in their noise element. And there's also kind of a prescriptive, like a distance from the freeway type of thing that you can use as well. Ozone depletion for CFCs, halons. Again, these are pretty standard at this point. Supermarket refrigeration was added in the code cycle, maybe before last, to make sure that because I mean, that's the thing, the refrigerant, if you're looking for like, what's the next thing that we're going to be targeting, look to refrigerants, because that's, R410A is now has too high of a global warming potential, but refrigeration for wineries, supermarkets, we're definitely going to be looking at refrigerants for ways to reduce global warming potential. Okay, so those are the mandatory measures. And we'll finish up here with just kind of a quick touch on the voluntary tiers. And again, these are divided up by A4 is residential and A5 is non-residential. And basically it's kind of like, again, a lead checklist where you can, where you're adding in tier 1 some mandatory measures, and then you need to pick a certain number of electives within each category. And then tier 2 is similar process, but just a little bit more. So adding where it says 4 required, so it tells you exactly. So lighting, the energy threshold, you need to be, 5 or 10% better. Lighting power density needs to be better. Outdoor lighting needs to be better, that type of thing. Water, needs to be 12% better than the mandatory measures. And, one of the 8 electives or 2 of the 8 electives. So it might be recycled water, lower irrigation, or, something like that. And so it goes through for each of those. Voluntary tiers, residential. Similar for non-residential. Again, these tables will be in your packet. And usually, again, we have a big worksheet, and so it's easy for the jurisdiction to tell. We kind of highlight which of the electives we're going after. So note, San Luis Obispo County does have a tier 1 requirement for projects over 10,000 square feet, but for their program, they don't require the energy reach code. So that part is exempt, but the rest of it you have to do. So heat island effect, a few of those. And then I just wanted to add in here at the end that they've added in the intervening code cycle a bird-friendly building design as an elective measure under the energy, tier 1, tier 2. And I think that's interesting because it has to be pretty important for them to bother to put it into the intervening code cycle. So this is something that is kind of triggering, like, oh, maybe this is going to show up as a mandatory measure because they're really seeing the impacts, especially as we have more density, taller buildings, that we're getting some bird deaths. So the idea is to kind of look at this as a best practice going forward, so that 90% of the building elevation has bird-friendly mitigation strategies. And so that's the building facade and atriums, even glass rails can have bird damage issues or bird deaths. So glazing with visual markers, you could do films, you could do glass blocker channels, you can have some, glazing technology. So maybe it's something that would be reflective in a way that doesn't impact birds in the same way. It can also be physical slats or screens or nettings or louvers. So just keep an eye out for that as kind of an emerging green building requirement. So with that, I do want to say that we do have a free energy code coach service through 3C Ren. Inbound Screen Consulting is proud to be a provider of that service. So if you have questions on the Title 24 Energy Code or CalGreen, and sometimes it's an interpretation, sometimes it's a process question, but just go ahead and it's online at 3cren.org, or you can call and it gets routed to us, and we'll respond to those types of questions for your calls. And then closing, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Naomi to highlight anything for continuing education, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So again, there are continuing education units available. So please contact me if you have any questions. My email is there and it'll be in the slides as well. You will get an email with the slides and a recording as well as a survey. So please fill that out. And just to highlight some of our upcoming courses, we have a couple more this week. One on all electric residential buildings, a couple on carbon reduction coming up, and you can always go to 3cren.org/events for the full catalog of trainings coming up. And I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll, if you would not mind filling that out just on the course, and then I can hand it back to Andy to do so many questions if you have the time to stick around.
Yeah, great. So thanks everyone for being here. I understand if you have to drop off, we will linger though and see if there are any questions. I know there were a couple that came up in the chat that I want to maybe circle back to that we weren't able to manage in the moment. But before we do that, I do want to just do a quick pitch to this July 18th carbon reduction through building electrification. This is, we did a zero net carbon design series maybe a year and a half ago, because California, in order to be a licensed architect, you have to have 5 hours of ZNCD continuing education. So we've done a whole new, developing a whole new series. It's again in 5 parts. This is the first one. If you are an architect in San Luis Obispo, we're going to be offering it in person in the fall through the AIA. So you're welcome to come and check that one out. and or you can do them online. You can kind of mix and match. So it'll walk through this. First one is kind of an overview of operational carbon, where it's going in California, some about refrigerants and all of that. Then we'll go into heat pump water heaters, all electric, other appliances, envelope ventilation kinds of related issues for all electric construction, and then also appliances, like including electric cooktops, induction cooktops, electric grills, and just making sure you have the whole picture of how to do all electric. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing so that we can answer any questions that folks have. All right, and you are welcome to put it in the chat, but you can also raise your hand and unmute, and we had maybe 35 or 40 all together, and I understand it's lunch hour, so people need to drop off, and the slides will be emailed out to everyone soon, and there's the presentation was recorded, and so that'll be available on the website, so you can send colleagues there as well. All right, so questions. Thanks everyone.
There were a couple in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
We didn't get to during the presentation. What codes prescribe or performance specify waterless restrooms?
Yeah, I saw that question, and if George is still on, maybe you want to unmute and explain that one a little bit. You had another one as well that I couldn't quite answer on the fly. We certainly have waterless urinals, and that's within the plumbing code. That's totally allowed. But otherwise, there's not really, I don't know that I have anything particularly to add on that. We do find, the lower flow fixtures, people might have used a very low flow fixture like 10 years ago, and maybe didn't have as great a performance, but now maybe now they're seeing, anyway, be open-minded to try them again. 0.8 gallons per flush is actually a really good performing toilet. Waterless urinals, I know that there was kind of some smell concerns, but again, they've gotten better, and there's a certain convenience for that, or maybe it's not even water every flush, but every 40 flushes or something like that. So there's a lot of emerging technology on reducing water.
Thank you. So if there's a piece of furniture that does not receive water and does not produce sewage, then perhaps there is no code to prescribe it. Is that correct?
Correct. Although there's certainly health codes in terms of if you're two issues, right? One, there's just a health code for any kind of public space that if it is a piece of furniture that's waterless, it's still going to trigger the health code. So plumbing compliance there. But also, I know that there are pilot programs where you can try for a waterless, like composting toilet, because sometimes a jurisdiction will require, oh, you can do a composting toilet as a residential, but you still need to be fully plumbed for a regular toilet because the next owner might not want it. So I don't know actually, and if somebody else knows, or maybe you know, George, in terms of what the state, where that's evolved in terms of statewide versus last I looked, it was jurisdiction by jurisdiction was allowing different pilot programs. So yeah, that's a super fair question. It's in a residential setting. The other thing that's interesting about water is just that that's evolved in terms of gray water. So we didn't really touch on that, but if you do a laundry to landscape, you don't need a permit at all. If you do showers and washing machines to gray water supply, then it's a very low threshold of engineering. If you want to try to bring gray water back into your building, then even just to flush toilets, then it's a different level of cleaning and permitting. So, but definitely working on more and more of that. We're doing a project in a non-residential project, but they generate a bunch of laundry. And so that's going to have a laundry to landscape system, but it's pretty sophisticated, just in order to be able to filter and have a really long lasting kind of system. So lots of exciting things happening in the water category. All right. Any other questions, or comments, feedback, anything folks are excited about, dreading, experience with embodied carbon yet? Otherwise, maybe we did it. All right. I see no more. All right, we're going to let you go. You have an extra 4 minutes of your life back. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you, everyone. And thanks to Andy and Tatiana for a great course today.